When you talk about having impact in your work, what are you even talking about? A lot of us use this term impact. We talk about joyful impact, the joyful impact journey. People talk about high impact organizations, high impact funders. What are we talking about when we talk about impact? And how do we really measure impact? This challenge is really at the heart of the challenge of social change. And particularly if you're a social entrepreneur or if you're a funder, paying attention to what you're defining as impact and how you're assessing it is really fundamental to maximizing your impact. So we're going to really explore this, and we're going to start by thinking about how do we define impact. And this is where there's a real benefit in the international development world has done a lot of thinking about this issue of how you define impact, in part because the UN and many other international agencies have been working for decades, whether on the Sustainable Development Goals or other interventions, where understanding how you equate the input of resources with the ultimate outcomes that you want is really important. And as a result, I think we can get a lot by just looking at some of the literature here. And one piece in particular came out, I think it's about 5 years old now. And it's from the Methods Lab, which actually worked with the Australian government to try to understand how do we understand impact in economic development internationally. And this is actually taken from this. This is a chart where they literally walk down 11 different agencies that work on different kinds of global development. And 11 agencies, 11 different definitions. I mean, they're similar, there's a lot of alignment, but they're not all precisely the same. And so, in a field that thinks about this intensively, if there isn't full alignment on how we define impact, I think that's a good wake-up call for all of us who might work in fields where the discussion about impact is not nearly as far along. This is something we really need to pay attention to. So let's really focus just to be as simple as we can. If you take all those 11 definitions and you really sort of look out across the field, what this really boils down to is that impact is an outcome that can be causally linked to a specific action or set of actions. So we think of impact really connected with somebody taking action, right? And something changes out in the world. We have a calling to make the world a better place. We want to have an impact on something out there in the world. So let's say something changes. We're going to call that an outcome. And that change is the causal result of an action or a set of actions. And, there are some other dimensions we want to think about here. It plays out over time. Sometimes we can see an impact literally, like one definition in the dictionary is you hit something, like literally like one thing hits another thing. That's an impact. But also the idea of causation is really connected to this idea of impact. It can be positive or negative, right? So we often think about impact implicitly. We're saying almost as if there is no negative impact. We're focused on let's really have impact here, but we can have negative impact too, and it can be unintended or it can be something that we are intentionally pursuing, and it can be something we predict, we anticipate it will happen, or it can be a complete surprise. So those are dimensions we want to think about. And we'll look at some tools a little later on that get into that to make sure we're really considering all the possibilities when we talk about impact. So just to break this down and look at this kind of causal chain as an example, let's just take a lot of us who work in the education space right now, whether we're funders or whether we're out there in the field, we are thinking about learning recovery. We're thinking about tutoring because in the midst of this pandemic, so many kids really need help catching up. They've missed so much education. So let's look at tutoring actually as an example of something where, okay, is it a high impact tutoring program? Well, what does that even mean? Well, the first thing is that in this causal chain are the inputs, money, tutors, tablet computers, whatever you're using to deliver that program. Then the actions, right? And by the way, these causal arrows, you see them get a little smaller as we go. Like the causality becomes less certain over time. So planning and execution of the tutoring program, those are the actions. Next step is the outputs. What does the tutoring program itself produce, right? We can measure the number of students served, the number of tutoring sessions delivered, but now we have to cross the chasm from output to outcome. And this is where a lot of grief comes in, where we don't know for sure. Was it our tutoring program that actually led to, the students performing better on some standardized assessment? we could actually, try to, have a randomized controlled trial and isolate the causal intervention and try to make a tight attribution of impact. But chances are we're not going to know for sure. That causation is loosely coupled. And then furthermore, at the individual level of outcomes, maybe down the road, what we really care about is that kids get back on track, that they are on track for positive life outcomes of employment and college and happiness and satisfaction in life. And those are individual outcomes that matter the most. I mean, the student doesn't, none of us really care that much about whether a student, where they perform on a standardized assessment. What we really want to know is what are the life outcomes for them? How is that going to be different? And that is much harder to assess and to figure out. We can certainly track those folks over time, but was it a cause of anything that we did over here? That's much harder to establish. And then we go on to community level outcomes. Maybe we care about youth employment and we're measuring that. And then even more broadly, well, if we have a better youth employment, do we have a stronger economic growth rate overall? So when you look at any field that you're in, where you care about impact, where you care about getting to these individual, community, and society level outcomes, you want to ask, how certain are the causal links? How big are these causal arrows? How sure are you that each of these steps is coupled? And is the chain of causation simple, complicated, or complex? And so this is an idea, that baking chocolate chip cookies is simple. You follow the recipe and it turns out the same every way. That's a simple causal chain. One thing very tightly leads to the other. Landing a manned spacecraft on the moon is complex, or rather complicated. It's like a series of chocolate chip recipes all stacked together. They all have to be followed. But if you follow them all, you can do it, you can repeat it. It's replicable. You can do it again and again. Complex is like the difference between raising my youngest son and raising my oldest son, right? They're two totally different human beings, and they're going to come out differently, right? You could do exactly the same thing as a parent, but you will get different results. And so understanding what is the nature of the challenge you are confronting and what kind of causal chain are you dealing with is crucial for figuring out what kind of evaluation or measurement of impact actually makes sense or is even possible. The second dimension is how much control do you have over outcomes? And it could be that you have direct control, right? So back here, it's conceivable. Like let's say in a vaccine campaign, the outcome is very tightly coupled, like being resistant to a disease. If you get the vaccine, chances are you're going to be, certainly if you got Pfizer or Moderna in the midst of this pandemic, 95% likelihood that you won't have serious illness within a couple of weeks of being vaccinated. So that's a very tight couple between the output, which is the vaccination, and the outcome, which is resistance to disease. But so that would give you a lot of direct control in a situation like that. But it could be that if you're doing advocacy or something else, the best you can hope for is influence, and maybe not even direct influence. Maybe it's indirect influence. And so the further along this causal chain you get, the less likely it is that you have direct control over the outcomes you really care about. Much less, certainly you might have some influence, but you very likely don't have direct control. Why does this all matter? Because depending on the environment that you operate in strategically, whether you're a funder or a social entrepreneur, it's very helpful to think about these two dimensions of uncertainty in the causal chain and the level of control over producing outcomes. And this guy, Alnoor Ibrahim, who's been working on this for decades in the international development space and also working with philanthropists, written a book I really recommend called Measuring Social Change. And this is taken from his book, this chart. But what he points out is that there's actually kind of 4 different strategies that you might think about having if, depending where you fall in terms of how much control you have over outcomes and how much uncertainty there is in your causal chain. And many of the folks in our Joyful Impact Accelerator who work in advocacy, you guys live up here in emergent and ecosystem strategies where uncertainty is high. The causal chain is not super clear, and you have varying degrees of control over your outcomes. Some people might be working in a direct service program, like a tutoring program, where it might be more over here, like an integrated strategy, or maybe even a tutoring is like a niche where you're doing one thing, you need to do it really well, and ultimately you don't know if you're going to have those long-term outcomes, but you're going to do the best you can to produce the outputs that you're accountable for. So this all connects, and I know I'm throwing a lot at you here, but I really want to, the reason I'm sharing all this is that we talk about impact and we talk about evaluation in the world of philanthropy and social enterprise. Some folks have given this tremendous thought, but a lot of us, and I worked for years in this field, running an advocacy organization without reference to any of these frameworks. I just sort of said, hey, if I can raise the money and people believe in what we're doing, we're good. And I think that certainly can work. But if you take the time to be more intentional about breaking down, like, hey, what am I really doing here? I think there's an opportunity for funders and social entrepreneurs to get more aligned about the different models of measurement that really make the most sense for the context in which you're operating. That's really the point that Ibrahim is making in this book. It's saying, like, hey, we should recognize these different contexts and approach impact and evaluation in a different way based on the level of certainty and the level of control that you have over causation and outcomes. And so this is kind of, just to break this down, right? Standardization. He says, listen, if you're in this niche strategy, if you're like doing a polio immunization campaign, right, which is going on right now, trying to eradicate polio in Africa and parts of South Asia, where it's almost completely knocked down. It's really simple. Like, we got to get people vaccinated, and if we reach that critical threshold, we can actually achieve this outcome that we really care about. So that's a very simple. It's not easy to do, but the measurement and the evaluation are fairly straightforward. Next, you might go to coordination. An example here would be like the Harlem Children's Zone. We'll take 10 square city blocks and let's do everything that we can think of in this chain of impact or outcomes to help young people have a thriving life. And so there are going to be metrics and milestones along the way towards the outcome. And here we might actually want to hold ourselves, in the Harlem Children's Zone accountable for individual level outcomes over time. If this intervention is working, we want to see that kids are actually having better life outcomes over time. Now we go to orchestration. So many of you may have heard of Strive and collective impact models, where a whole community, 100 different agencies come together with a backbone organization to measure quality of life for young people or indicators of economic development in a whole city. And everyone is working on their own piece, and that backbone organization is coordinating so that all these different efforts kind of converge on the impact that you want at the population level. And then for many of you, working in advocacy, you're going to be familiar with this idea that your strategy, you can't set it, you can't have a 5-year plan if you're working in advocacy and policy change, because most likely everything changes sometimes from day to day. And sometimes you take a step forward and then literally you loop backwards. And then from there you can leap even further forward. And that is literally, if you tracked what happened in the Freedom to Marry campaign, you literally see these loops, right, which ultimately led to the breakthrough of a Supreme Court decision and really a right to marry for everyone across the whole country, which when Evan Wolf and others laid out that campaign, more than a decade earlier, they did not have that exactly mapped out, but it emerged in a very powerful way. And so then think about if you were a funder in these different arenas, or an entrepreneur, how do you want to be thinking about that? What do you want to be measuring, and what do you want to be held accountable for? It's different in each case. And I really recommend the book. We're not going to get way into the weeds here, but drawing those distinctions is really critical, because as a funder, if you are taking an advocacy organization and trying to measure them like a polio immunization campaign or a Harlem Children's Zone, you're going to have a lot of problems, both for you as a funder, and you're going to be creating problems for the social entrepreneur. So another piece here is just this idea that impact is not always positive, right? So we also really need to pay attention to the fact that we focus on, the intended and foreseen goals of a program, right? That's this 1 out of these 6 quadrants is what we focus on when we're justifying a strategy and going for it. But a lot of other stuff can happen. We can have positive unintended stuff. We can have unforeseen emergent goals that happen over time. And then over here, we can have negative, like predicted risks, stuff we foresaw it and we knew it was a risk, or we can have like real calamity disaster that we didn't foresee and that emerged over time. And the point here is just pay attention to this stuff and don't proceed as if positive is the only thing. So just some takeaways here. Performance metrics and milestones are most meaningful when the causal chain is simple and outcomes are easily controlled. And too often, We see funders who have a desire for certainty about impact trying to place these kinds of metrics and milestones on top of an emergent process that it doesn't fit. And likewise, the more complex the causal chain and the less control you have, the more you need to have proximity and patience and trust to truly assess impact. And we talk a lot in our work about expeditionary evaluation, the idea that you're taking a journey together, the social entrepreneur and the funder, and the social entrepreneur is up on the front lines. They can see how the landscape is shifting and what might need to be done differently. The path literally emerges as you are walking down it. And if you are the funder who's resourcing that expedition and you're not on the front lines, you better have trust and a lot of communication back and forth, and the flexibility on both sides to keep adjusting as you go. What the point we just made, positive interventions do not automatically arise just because you have positive intentions. And again, having proximity is really key to knowing if things are going off course, and having trust and being able to communicate with each other to say, hey, you know what, we thought this was going to be the way this impact played out, but this causal chain actually works a different way, or there's this new thing that's happening that we actually think deserves even more focus. So it's vital to have that flexibility and proximity and trust to make course corrections as you go. This is a really important one. Don't let a fixation on attribution of impact get in the way of contribution to impact. So these words are different, right? Attribution means I can attribute the impact to a specific action, a specific organization. I know with certainty that what I did produced this outcome. That's the gold standard that many funders and social entrepreneurs have in mind. They want to know that their money, their program, their effort is making the difference. And yet, when we get into complex arenas where some of the highest stakes are, when we talk about making the world a better place and really tackling tough problems, we're not going to be able to get attribution in a perfect way. We can't often design randomized controlled trials that can truly prove that this thing causes that thing. Instead, what we can go for is contribution, right? That we can know that what we did contributed to an outcome. Maybe many people were needed. It's an ecosystem. Lots of people had to get involved. Or maybe we just have to, the outcome is so long-term that we're never really going to know for sure that our input way back here in the causal chain. So we have to proceed in some ways on faith. It doesn't mean that there's no evidence, but you have to have a different mindset, a different approach to evaluation it's almost like you need to have the mindset of an intelligence analyst as opposed to a laboratory-based scientist who wants to prove something through an experimental design. You can still figure out what's going on out in the world through analyzing intelligence, multiple sources, and putting together the best picture that you can. Many funders are uncomfortable with that as a mindset. Some take to it naturally. Most social entrepreneurs who are on the front lines do that intelligence analysis without even thinking about it. That's how you know what's going on around you. And that's why it's so important for you guys who are on the front lines to be trusted advisors to those who are not. Because that's the only way we're really going to figure out and have funding flow where it really needs to go in these complex environments. And so this comes back to the 4 commitments of joyful impact. And we talk about this all the time. Get visionary, right? Prioritize visionary social impact over your ego-driven needs for certainty, etc. This really screws up measurement of impact a lot when people are bringing this need for attribution in, to gratify ego or whatever else. Getting real, seeking and speaking the truth. That's hard to do, but we've got to do it to do this the right way. And getting together, like measurement and evaluation of impact in social change is about how we work together. And so much of what goes on here actually treats people poorly on both sides of that. There's a lack of trust. So I'm not here to, point fingers at anybody, but what I am here to say is if everyone raises their own standard of behavior, we're going to see better outcomes. We're going to see more impact for everyone. And this, of course, that's what I just shared, this idea of getting better. We individually, each one of us has to step up to really deliver our full impact. We have to grow. We have to expand our consciousness and raise our perspective. And yes, even get into some of the weeds of what we just talked about today, of how you actually get to the bottom of understanding what impact is and how in your particular corner of the world and the change that you're trying to make, what that model looks like and how do you really assess it and evaluate it and maximize it. If you like this video and you want to access the worksheet or any other material that goes with it, just click the link below or head on over to joyfulimpact.co. That's the website where we have all the material we use for working with coaching and personal development for change agents. You can set up a free account in the members area, and you can also check out the blog where we have new content coming out all the time. Why are we putting all this out there for free? Because the world has never been more in need of a new, greatest generation of change agents. I hope this material is helpful to you, and if it is, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. That will help us spread the word.